All right, this is October 1st. This is ESM 105. The year is 2025. And here we are on slide number 8 of the week 5 through 6 PowerPoint. For anybody watching the recording, that's where we're starting. Biome talk. All right, now you're going to take a lot of classes where you run through biomes. It's a pretty standard thing where you'll go through all the different biomes and talk about their characteristics and talk about why they're under threat and all these different aspects. I've decided in ESM 105 to talk about a few key biomes, all right, ones which are relevant to our location and ones which are relevant globally because they're especially at risk or undergoing more rapid rates of degradation. So we're only going to talk about, I think, like 6 or 7 or something like that, instead of talking about all of these. I'm not asking you to memorize biome type or their characteristics necessarily, but I want you to see how the interaction of precipitation and temperature is used to define all the different biomes. So we talked about some patterns of wind movement, all right, how moisture leaves the air, what determines how much moisture can be held. That sort of starts to let you see patterns in where all of the plant growth is. Yes?
So is it mostly moisture and temperature that defines a biome?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a very simplified model for defining different ecological regions, right? They're all characterized by precipitation and average temperature. And that's how we define the categories of, say, a temperate forest, or a temperate rainforest, or a boreal forest, or the tundra, right? But there are additional characteristics as well, and there's variability in where these things are found. So it's all about temperature and precipitation to define the broad category, and then there'll be variability within the category. But in some textbooks, they'll introduce this as saying, precipitation and temperature determines the plant community in a given area, and then the plant community determines the animal community. And that's way too simplified, I think. I want to introduce it to you more as this is how we define the terms, and it's all, and it's kind of an artificial construct, but it works to predict what the community will look like. It's a way too long drawn out answer to your question. The real answer to your question is yes. All right, 2 variables to determine biome types. Awesome. Good. So I've talked to you about topography and its importance. So there's this other idea of vertical zonation. If you've got a mountain that is in a given biome, as you move up in elevation, that can adjust temperature and precipitation. So if we've determined those, or we've defined those as our most important variables, it makes sense that there can be different types of biomes as you go up in elevation as well. All right, so just making sure that we're all comfortable with the with the importance of topography in determining plant community, as well as global patterns of air movement and how much moisture the air can hold based on its temperature. Cool? Awesome. All right, we're going to talk about a few select terrestrial biomes, and then we're going to talk about a few marine biomes, and then we're going to talk about lakes. They're all important. And usually you focus on terrestrial biomes. Usually I focus on terrestrial biomes. And this year I really have realized, and last semester really, this big blind spot of we never talk about marine biomes. Like those matter too. So we'll talk about those a little bit here today. Okay? Oh, here's that generalization that plant community determines animal community, justifying, characterizing the terrestrial biomes. Anyways, terrestrial biomes are often defined by what's the dominant plant. And it's not usually dominant based on number of individuals, because if you think about, like, what do we have as a good example here? An oak woodland. There's 2 oaks. Look at how many grass plants there are. Why don't we call it a grass woodland or a grassland? Because we're talking usually about biomass, all right? When you're characterizing plant communities, it's more common to determine dominance by biomass rather than by number of individuals. Does that sort of make sense as a distinction? in community ecology dealing with animals, it's more or population ecology, it's more common to deal in number of individuals rather than biomass. But that's because plants behave differently than animals. You've seen it. Okay, great. Biomes. Let's talk about some. Once again, I'm not asking you to memorize the combination of characteristics. I'm just going to run through these as some examples of biomes since we've been talking about how to define them. Okay? So we've got tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests have a lot of rainfall and a constant and warm temperature. So temperature is the red line, precipitation is the blue line. All right? Pretty cool. There it is. This is a nice, simple sort of climate diagram. You'll see these for each different biome type. So you know about tropical rainforests. You probably know that they're mostly sequestered around the equator. And hopefully now that we've discussed the pattern of solar radiation providing energy and the air movement going up and then dropping the rain immediately because it loses pressure and it cools as it does that at the equator. All right, you see why there would be abundant rainfall year-round. Solid. Tropical rainforests. Tropical rainforests are important. They're a large carbon pool, and we've talked a little bit about carbon sequestration, okay, but it's an aspect to think about when you're considering what's wood being used for, okay? Because wood is a large pool of carbon. There's also a large pool of fixed carbon in dead matter in the soil, dead matter on top of the soil. So when you're considering conservation efforts aimed at reducing the amount of carbon-containing gases in the atmosphere, and you're trying to reduce greenhouse gases, right? It's good to think about what's holding carbon in a stable form. Because we've talked already about a carbon cycle, how carbon exists as gases in the atmosphere, and then it gets fixed into complex, stable molecules, where then it can't be carbon in the atmosphere, right? And that's good for us if we're trying to reduce greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, to have more plant material, right? Reasonable enough? Okay, awesome. So when you cut down wood to burn it for heat or energy, that's very different than cutting down wood and building a house with it. More of the carbon stays sequestered in the house than if you burn it all immediately. It's not a value statement, it's a statement of fact that's telling you, like, hey, if you're looking at conservation efforts and where you're going to target for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, think about the destiny of the wood following deforestation, as well as the impact of deforestation itself. That'll come back again in an upcoming PowerPoint. All right, cool. So, the 50% of the Earth's species, all this diversity in the tropical rainforest. There's a lot of carbon held there. There's a lot of plant cover there, all right, on a global scale. Cool. All right, we know about tropical rainforests. They've got all sorts of different plant types that grow there that sort of characterize the biome. A lot of epiphytic plants. Epiphytes meaning on top of, phytos meaning plant. So epi, like your epidermis. Epiphyte are plants that live on plants, okay? Many orchids are like this. They do really well in areas that have a lot of regular water availability because they're not growing in the soil. And so there's not this big pool of stored water. Just fun stuff to think about. Cool. Deserts. Deserts have very low precipitation, all right? Higher temperatures. Okay, now check this out. These climate diagrams are intentionally set up where the axes are determined so that you can estimate times when there's not enough precipitation to allow for plant growth. This is another broad generalization. It's not going to be perfect because different plants have different life history strategies and can tolerate different amounts of water availability, right? But check this out right here. If the blue line's above the red line, there's enough precipitation for plant growth. If the blue line's below the red line, there's not enough precipitation for plant growth. That's how these figures are set up. That's how these axes are set up, you know, because you can move these things around. Question?
So for deserts,
I know the temperatures are high during the day, but I know at night it gets very cold.
Mm-hmm.
At least I went backpacking Joshua Tree once, and I like slept in the middle of the night, and the winds are just crazy, so it's like super cold.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's usually got an extreme temperature difference between day and night. That's another characteristic of desert biomes. But if we're going just with our defining factors, because then within desert biome, there are different types of desert. Like in Arizona, there's the high desert, which gets snow, for example. So it's like, yeah. But absolutely, that's another thing about deserts. And look, there's nothing here to buffer temperature variation. That's kind of what's going on there. And you can see where they persist. But look, these desert biomes are going to be different than the central desert biomes, or these desert biomes, or these desert biomes, right? In sort of those temperature fluctuation rates. Yeah, also awesome, very cool. Yeah. Tend to have smaller populations of plants and animals, lower primary productivity, right? Because it can't foster as much plant growth because of water availability. However, where there's vacant space, there is a niche, there are resources available, and nature abhors a vacuum like this. So plants and animals will develop ways to exploit that niche, get in there, and live in that space. All right? Plants can do it by developing very succulent stems for storing water. All right, the leaves are all reduced down to little prickles or spines, and the stem is converted into the primary photosynthetic organ, and also carries out water storage. All right, solid. Here's the cacti. Here's a cactus example. Here's an example from the family Euphorbiaceae, which is another family that does well in these environments and has a similar, this is convergent evolution here, where these plants are distantly related, but they look similar. They've both evolved to have a lot of the same morphologies, okay? Great, yeah. Now, not all members of Euphorbiaceae are succulent plants like this, okay? There are some that are adapted to temperate environments as well. We've got some native ones that grow here. But one of the common characteristics of the euphorbs is they exude latex when you break them open. So I don't know. If you want, I can show you some euphorbs outside. They're pretty cool. They look almost like clovers. Anyways, but they're really small. Anyways, very good. Temperate grasslands, very important biome. They are at constant risk because of conversion into grazing or pasture land, right? So everybody wants to use these grasslands to grow up animals so we can eat the animals, okay? So check this out. Once again, we've got, it's not that, here we are. Here's the climate diagram once again. Temperature here, okay? And then there's precipitation here, indicating that year-round there's enough precipitation to allow for plant growth. So the plants don't necessarily have to enter a dormant phase except for this sub-freezing, temperature that we start to hit around here. See that 0 right there? So that's an important thing to think about when you're talking about temperate grasslands. Temperate grasslands tend to have high soil fertility. All those grasses, they grow a bunch of roots, and then they die back during these colder temperatures. And then the roots rot. This takes carbon from the atmosphere and puts it into the soil, as well as, additional nutrients from the plants, okay? Very good. So one of the things to consider here with these grasslands is you go through and you till one of these all up so that you can plant a monoculture of grazing crop or something like that, all right? And what you do is you till up all this organic matter and you add in oxygen, and while that increases soil fertility because it gets a lot more biologic activity going on in the soil, it also allows decomposition to occur way more rapidly. And when that happens with decomposition, you're just pumping carbon dioxide and methane and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because of all the bacteria and fungi that are carrying out cellular respiration. And then you get the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression, because you disturb the soil, you let it become depleted. Then you start to add nitrogen fertilizer. You get abundant plant growth, but you're not providing the other nutrients that are necessary. So the material becomes, you get a lot of material. It's full of new nitrogen that you provided, but then all these other nutrients, and then you have it eaten and you take the animals away, you know? Or you take the crops and you pull the crops away, so the nutrients don't enter the ecosystem again. So you're removing something from the system. You're making it a more open system, right? With these outputs that aren't being resupplied. And then yes, you end up with a big Dust Bowl. It's no good. You can't grow anything there for a long time. Cool stuff. I love it. I love it. They get converted to agriculture. I already talked to you a little bit about this. Okay. You can convert a grassland into, it's called desertification. You keep removing the plants, keep removing the plants, keep removing the plants, and you're continuously removing resources from the system, and you can run into these issues due to overgrazing. Also, these biomes have not evolved to have supplemental irrigation applied to them. And when you're irrigating, there's this really interesting thing about salinization of soil that happens, especially when you're irrigating with water that's not, that you're moving from someplace else, or you're pulling up from the soil that's not natural rainfall. That water tends to have a little more salt in it. You spray it onto the soil, and the plants love it. It's great. But the salt sticks in the soil. And now the soil's a little more saline. So you apply more irrigation. You can even try to apply enough irrigation to flush the salts out of the soil. But if you don't do it right, you apply more water that has a little salt in it. The salt accumulates in the soil. The plants grow with the water. You do it again, and again, and again. And eventually, the soil becomes super saline. And now it has, I don't think we'll talk about osmotic pressures in this class, even though I love to talk about that topic. But you get too many osmotically active solutes in the soil solution or attached to the soil particles, so water actually starts to draw out of the plant roots. Just take any of my other courses if you want to talk about osmosis. I love it. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about, but I'm trying to stop myself here. Okay. So irrigation can cause the soil to become more saline, which is pretty counterintuitive. It all depends on the irrigation water quality, how often you do it, if you apply enough water to let the salts flush through the soil profile. So it's all things to think about as you're learning more and more about grassland conservation and about conservation of any system that's under intense management, including irrigation. Okay, cool. Temperate shrublands and woodlands. These have Mediterranean-type climates, all right, with cool, wet winters and hot, dry summers. Here's the classic climate diagram for a temperate shrubland/woodland, all right? Now, this is all modified. You look at the distribution pattern on the planet, and you can see, oh, this is definitely modified by mountain ranges, proximity to the ocean, things like that. So in general, a temperate shrubland or woodland is going to have a period of insufficient precipitation for plant growth. The blue line dips below the red line. Okay, the Mediterranean-type climates. What do we got? Yeah, cool, wet winters, hot, dry summers. All right, distributed throughout the globe. Check it out. I should have that picture of air patterns show up again and again. Next time when I do the PowerPoint, I'll have that just be like, now look at where the air is moving. It'll be fun. But that's for the future. What are they characterized by? Evergreen shrubs and trees. This includes chaparral, okay, which is it's like an endangered habitat type, sort of around here. You get it on the other side of mountains usually, okay, where you got a lot of shrubby plants, small trees. They can result due to salt pressure. They can result from lower amounts of precipitation available due to topographic effects, okay? But the chaparral is an important ecosystem type. So check this out. How does a chaparral get maintained if it exists in a biome that should be a temperate woodland? Well, succession gets arrested by regular fire. So the fire comes through and it suppresses the larger trees, okay, allowing shrubs to persist. That's the general rule of thumb there. So that's another one of those examples where fire suppression puts the biome or puts the ecosystem type at risk because it is adapted to disturbance. Disturbance is the norm. Yes?
And that disturbance historically came from indigenous peoples.
Yes.
Quote unquote non-human occurring.
Yes. There's a combination. It's a combination of naturally occurring fire and human-mediated fire. Of course, it's never just purely one or the other. But indigenous cultures did burn these habitats for different reasons, maintaining different types of plant growth. Different types of plant growth. Traditional knowledge of just knowing that of passing down. We need to burn these areas at these intervals. There's tons of great reasons for doing it. And then that maintains these habitat types. And so removing that human-mediated burning is the same impact as suppressing natural ignitions, right? Yeah. In that PowerPoint, yeah, anyways. Cool. Temperature, here's a picture of California ones. Great. Human impacts. The thing that puts these biomes at risk is always human impacts, development, agriculture, okay? Turn it into a vineyard, turn it into a grove, turn it into an orchard of some sort, all right? And now you've just lost that natural system. Okay, cool. I love it. Yeah, solid. Oh, climate change leading to adjustments of fire frequencies, making them more regular rather than less regular, can also, affect the ecosystem. So climate change, it becomes drier, fires happen more regularly, fire suppression's been reduced, and the cultures that did the prescribed burning are no longer there. So that big combination means now you've got fuel loads building up, natural ignition that's not controlled, big fire regularly, preventing the establishment of the shrubs, allowing only the grasses and plants that have a very short life cycle to persist. So problems. Top to bottom. Okay, great. Temperate evergreen forests. Look, hey, that's like us, right? Basically. Cool. We're abutting it. We got some of it. Yeah. What do we got here? High rainfall, mild winters. Cool. No period of deficit. All right, usually plenty of water to allow for plant growth year round. No freezing in the winter. Yeah.
Would this be where we are? Are we in a...
Yeah, we're in a temperate evergreen forest. Also, we're in a temperate rainforest. Also, we're near temperate shrubland and woodland. So we've got a complicated set of biomes in our area, partially because of a complicated geology due to uplift and all these different movements of plates that have different compositions, partially due to a complicated topography here. So a large global map like this doesn't fully capture the variability in our general region here. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, great. Temperate evergreen forests, love them. We're doing just fine. Alrighty. They tend to be dominated by conifers or broadleaf trees. All right, so as a conifer, it's a broadleaf forest because that's the dominant plant type. That's where the forests get their names from, right? We're always talking about that, or I already talked to you about that a little bit. This is great. I'm happy about this. The leaves tend to be acidic. This makes the soils slightly acidic, okay? So, nutrient availability for plants is affected by soil acidity. So you can have abundant nutrients, but if the soil is too acidic or too basic, plants can't access it. They end up tied up in the soil or converted into forms that flow through the soil and are unavailable. So soil acidity is actually incredibly important for plant growth, okay? Because like I said, You can have all the nutrients you need, but if you don't have the correct soil pH, then those nutrients are unavailable. Okay. Good stuff. Forests, rainforests, human impacts on forests and rainforests. You log them, okay? You pull the wood out of the forest. That's going to affect the composition of the community, obviously. All right? I'm going to talk to you in the next PowerPoint about primary and old growth forests a little bit, but I kind of wanted to I was trying to lay the seeds earlier, plant the seeds earlier of like, what is the wood going to be used for? That matters, okay? Big problem here with tree planting practices. You remove a bunch of trees that were all different ages and maybe even different species, and then you plant a bunch of the same species, all right? Whether it's Douglas fir or redwood or whatever you're planting in there, okay, it's usually planted because it's a good crop tree, right? It's harvested for wood. They're all the same age, so they all hit the same stages at the same time. And if a pathogen that can capitalize on a certain stage of plant growth gets into the area, it just comes through and kills all the plants because they're all at exactly the same stage of development, have the same defenses that this pathogen can overcome. So having a forest of trees made up of differing ages is, beneficial. And that's an important aspect of plant ecology, is defining stages of plants as they go through their life cycle. It's usually determined by size. It's a thing that you'll worry about some other time. Okay, cool. Fire suppression, problem, increased stand density, more intense fires. The communities are usually adapted to fires. There's individuals that are adapted to, I remember our CSR framework, we talked about it in the week 3 through 4 PowerPoint actually. Plants that are adapted to tolerating not a stress, not competition. Yeah, stress, a stress, absolutely, a disturbance adapted plant, okay? So there are plants that are adapted to tolerating the fires, and that's how they persist in the environment. That's their competitive sort of strategy. But if the fire intensity, which is measured as the amount of energy released by the fire, all right, it's actually a metric, okay, something that you can measure. If the intensity of the fire gets too high because there's more fuel, because small fires aren't allowed to happen, then the fire intensity is so high that it destroys the plants which otherwise had adaptations to survive the fire. All right, so that's another big problem there. So fire intensity is something that's as important as fire frequency. They're interconnected, So we talk about a fire, we talk about the size of the fire, the speed at which the fire spreads, important things, the frequency of fires in a region, and also the intensity of the fire. And if a fire gets intense enough and releases enough energy, it can even start to destroy seeds in the seed bank in the soil, and that's a big problem. All right? Awesome. Air pollution, we can talk about that, yeah, sure. Anyways, marine ecosystems. Not that air pollution is not important, but damage to plants from air pollution is a complicated thing. Okay, good deal. Marine ecosystems. I forgot to shift my bullet points over. Oops. All right. Marine ecosystems are important, okay? There are photosynthetic organisms living in the ocean. They grow, they die, their detritus floats down to the ocean floor, it decays, oxygen availability defects decay rates, nutrients released well back up due to ocean circulation patterns. All right? We're mainly covered by oceans. Okay, question? No. I'm not confident enough to talk about it, honestly. I don't know enough about it.
The rivers wash sediment down from the mountains, and the salt accumulates like you were saying in the
Okay, there you go. Yeah. Rivers wash water into the ocean. It picks up salt. There you go. Perfect. Cool. Marine ecosystems. Here we are looking at chlorophyll concentrations on the globe. This is like a GIS sort of thing, right? You can look at chlorophyll concentrations on the planet by looking at areas where certain wavelengths of light are absorbed. It's pretty cool stuff. You can use techniques like LIDAR, oh my gosh. You blast different wavelengths of light at the planet's surface, and if it draws down a lot of photosynthetically active radiation, there's a lot of chlorophyll there. Standard issue technique. You do it on large scales, you do it on small scales. Agriculture uses it to determine where they need to apply more fertilizers or apply more irrigation. It's standard stuff. So here's a global map, all right, showing you concentrations of chlorophyll around the globe, all right? Chlorophyll concentration is being used to predict primary productivity, okay? So look, there's a lot of variability here. There's a lot of variability here. There's a lot of productivity in the oceans. There's a lot of productivity on the land. There you go. There's a dang map. Solid? Great. I'm excited to move into marine ecosystems. So, traditionally, people tried to apply terrestrial biome definitions sort of to marine biome definitions, right? But you can't really apply precipitation rates because it's all water, okay? So they were talking about depth and temperature was usually the two metrics because depth determines light availability, right? And then temperature determines growth rates. So I was like, okay, cool. We use depth and we use temperature to define the biomes. In modern marine biology, and I'm not a marine biologist, as you can tell by the fact that I didn't know why the oceans were salty, all right? So I'm not a very good marine biologist, and I've never claimed to be, but I am office mates with a very good marine biologist. And I had some conversations with her about marine ecosystems. So we'll see how well that sunk in. That's a play on words. Look at that. Stumbled right into it. That's great. So you used to define them by how deep is it and how warm is it. And that was just how you defined a marine biome. But now, current models are focused a lot on the substrate and how stable it is, because that has a huge impact on which plants can grow. And remember, the biome definitions are intended to predict the plant distributions, which are assumed to predict the animal distributions. That's our whole framework for the biome discussion. Okay, awesome. So another thing to think about, water and gas holding. If you take you have to take a physics course, right? Like some physics course, like physics for the biological sciences, physics 118 or something like that. Yes, no? Depends on your major. All right, cool. So check this out. A soda can, a sody pop can. You know when a soda's good is when it's got a lot of gas in it, right? A soda's good when it's cold and when it's under pressure. When you remove that pressure, all the gas escapes. So there are two primary determining factors in how much gas a fluid can hold. How much pressure it is under and how cold it is. A colder fluid can hold more gas. So that's why if you pull out a warm soda and you open it up, it goes flat so much faster, okay? The cold soda can hold the gas more effectively. And also, the can is under pressure. That's why it goes psh when you open it, because that pressure makes the fluid still hold the gas, instead of the gas all separating out and forming a layer at the top, and you just get a flat soda. So if you ever want to try to remember what are the physics of water and gas holding, just think of a soda. That's all you got to do. Cool. So all of that to talk about this. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. So in cold oceans, you can get pretty high productivity, okay? Holding more oxygen is essential for determining decomposition rates, right? Remember, this is not just primary productivity, this is overall productivity, okay? You need to be able to carry out respiration, not just photosynthesis. Yes?
I know this is maybe not your specialty, but
That's okay, I'll still talk about it.
this is why large animals tend to prefer colder water because there's more oxygen.
It's not enough. It's too much of a generalization, because all these large animals, they have different patterns of circulation, and what's a large animal versus a small animal? Do they have lungs, or do they depend on diffusion? There's all these different questions. Yeah. Yes.
Kind of add on to that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it kind of make sense if that's true because of there being more food, more productivity in the environment, so there's just an abundance of food compared to warm areas?
That's great. Is that what you were getting at more than? I was thinking about oxygen availability, they're big and they need more air.
Well,
See, this is where my brain was.
That's what I was thinking about too. I
Yeah.
wasn't really thinking about the food part. I was more thinking about more oxygen because
Yeah.
bigger animals.
Which is a reasonable thing to think about, and where my mind usually goes because of being a plant physiologist. I'm usually thinking about how can the organism move the oxygen through its body or the CO2 through its body. But thinking at the ecosystem level, all right, that makes a ton more sense because there's more productivity, there's more small animals, so bigger animals can exist off of the biomass. Yeah. Ah, you see, you stole the knowledge from another class and brought it in here. That's awesome. That sounds pretty right. Yeah. I'll ask my office mate about it. Yeah. Cool. Great. So some terminology. All right. Ocean systems classified by depth and location to shore. This is sort of the old framework. It also includes temperature. Okay. But we still use these pieces of terminology to describe ocean ecosystems. We have benthic, okay, which are at the bottom. We have pelagic, which are in the water column above the bottom. So the fish swimming around, pelagic. The things sitting on the bottom, benthic. The shore area is known as the littoral zone, all right? It's got a lot of litter. It's got nutrient inputs from the shore because there's litter falling into the ocean. There's water flowing into the ocean, bringing in nutrients from litter that got dissolved into water bodies. Litter. Littoral, I'm using it because of the mnemonic. Littoral, litter. Yeah. Cool. So solid with those three terms? You've probably heard benthic before. You've probably heard pelagic before. I don't know. You've probably heard benthic before at least, because that comes up. I don't know why that word just floats around. It's another joke. I don't know why y'all hate fun so much, No, this is great. So check this out. Textbook zones for the marine biomes. You've got estuaries, salt marshes, mangroves, rocky intertidal, sandy shore. In the shallow ocean, we've got coral reefs, seagrass beds, kelp beds, and then we've got the open and the deep ocean, okay? Don't memorize the biomes. You don't have to memorize the biomes. We'll talk about a couple of them, a couple that are at risk. I'm gonna talk about peat bogs and wetlands because they are basically mined for resources, and peat moss is close to my heart because I worked a lot with the turfgrass industry, and they're a major consumer of that sort of stuff. If you go to a good golf course, a really fancy one, they all want peat moss, there, and it's just a huge waste. But anyways, what's a golf course for if not waste? Yeah. Anyway, cool. Here we go. Check it out. Benthic, nearshore, shallow ocean, pelagic zone, okay? There's a photic barrier. That's all about how much light penetrates. And we'll talk about that as well because some benthic communities in the deep ocean, all right, are not going to be receiving any light. So they rely on heat as an energy source from, say, thermal vents. We'll talk about it a little bit. So good. Here's the textbook zones that I talked about. based mainly on water depth, okay? Water depth. Here's the modern framework for looking at marine biomes. So traditionally, depth is how you described it, because depth determines how much light there is, and there's, a piece of water, of a temperature, but it wasn't always even included in the definitions of the biomes, the marine biomes. So it's kind of wild to be like, we've got one variable in determining biomes in the ocean. Nowadays, or at least because these models always compete, all right? There's a competing model that's gaining traction in the field of marine biology, according to my office mate, all right? And it is this. It's all based around substrate mobility, which isn't that complicated. It's about how much stress does it take to make the substrate move, all right? And how much stress does the substrate usually incur? So it's all about like how stable it is, or substrate mobility would measure how mobile it is. So, which could be determined by things like particle sizes of the substrate. So on the bottom, is it moving or is it stable? And then you've got here gross primary productivity. So how much biomass is getting generated by the lower level of the community. And that lets you define all these different sorts of biomes. So it's a more complicated model for sure than the terrestrial biome model. That's just precipitation and temperatures, okay? But it actually leads to more accurate predictions, which is nice. Okay. Cool. So if you're going to get into marine bio, you want to know about marine biomes. Here we go. New view of ocean biomes. Look at it. It's incredible. All right, look at that. Look at that. I love it. Okay, so here's some different biomes based on substrate types. Check it out. Hard substrate, you can get coral reefs. All right, these things have to build up, right? They need a solid, low mobility substrate. Marshes, mangroves, seagrasses, these are characterized by vascular vegetation. So plants that have a developed vascular system, which they need because they're growing up out of the water too. Now there are plants that are entirely aquatic that still have vascular systems, but they're different because they don't have a lack of water availability for some of the plant material. It's a different system. Additional hard substrate, kelp forest, rocky shores, etc., right? Plants can be attached, more stable. You tend to get these bigger plants. Soft substrate, sandy and muddy bottoms, all right? No substrate, pelagic and deep ocean. All right? There's no substrate, they're floating around. They're in the pelagic zone. All right, just some marine biomes. Cool. Okay, we're still doing fine here. If you have light, you get higher densities of organisms. There's an energy input. If you are below the photic zone, you rely on the falling detritus, the dead matter coming from the photic zone. Stuff dies, it floats down. All right? So the big open ocean, we're going to talk about the things that are not, the other things that survive below the photic zone in an upcoming slide here. Very good soft substrate, okay? It's good for animals that burrow because the substrate has high mobility. So burrowing animals would be more dominant or prevalent in a marine biome that has a soft substrate. And so you see how that's kind of like, oh yeah, substrate stability is really important. Depth matters, but substrate mobility also matters. And hey, check this out. Check this out right here. Gross primary productivity is pretty drastically determined by depth, because depth, right, determines how much light gets in there. So this is just one step removed, really, from talking about depth. But when you're validating these models, you try both variables and you see which one gives you better predictions. Anyway, I'm getting too into the woods. which is almost a pun because we've been talking about biomes. Okay, but we don't have to worry about this. Here we go. I'm getting into the weeds. I'm getting into the seaweeds. Very good. Points for you. All right, cool. Listen, there's these marine biomes. I don't want you to memorize them. I'm just trying to show you that the framework for understanding them is different now. I was pretty excited to hear about that. I just wanted to pass that on to you. But let's talk about the Hadal zone. Okay, anybody play, what the heck's that game? It's this great game. It came out not that long ago. You're like a fisherman and you are, Dredge. Yeah, sick. And it's all like Lovecraftian and you have to get the stuff to fish into the Hadal zone. And it's like a weird hook and everything's spooky and there's a big monster and it's really great. Just play Dredge. It's super fun. I think it's like $15. Don't bother buying the expansion pack. The DLC isn't worth it, in my opinion. No. It's like a, yeah. It's the worst. This is what you need to know today. Your takeaway today is play Dredge, but don't purchase either of the 2 DLCs. It's like $10 for an hour of gameplay. This is the stuff. This is why you come to ESM 105. If you play Dredge, yeah, and you bring in a screenshot, totally. So anyways, check this out, right? We've got the very, 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 very deep ocean that's not receiving light, all right, but still has primary productivity. The organisms that are carrying out this primary productivity, okay, are mainly these tube worms, which are really cool animals. And they use, check it out, both they use chemical energy and thermal energy to drive a process that's kind of similar to photosynthesis, all right? So you've got these sulfur-containing compounds that emerge from the thermal vents. You would imagine that a thermal vent is gonna smell like farts, you know? It's got all these sulfur-containing compounds. They can carry out this process, there's energy in here, they go boom, 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 and they make glucose, and they release some water, and they release some sulfur, okay? That's generating, so they are chemosynthetic organisms, and there's a whole mutualistic relationship that's actually driving this chemosynthesis. It's bacteria that live in the tube worms. So, you talk about, the tube worms at the thermal vents are driving the primary productivity or providing the initial energy source for the rest of the Hadal community, all right? But it's really the symbiotic bacteria living inside of the tube worms that can carry out chemosynthesis, and they drive that primary productivity. It's pretty cool stuff. It's all tubes. Yeah, tube technology. So anyways, folks, thank you all so much. I went a minute over. I apologize for stealing a minute of your time. I hope you have enough time to get to your next class. I appreciate your continued participation and attendance. I hope you've been enjoying ESM 105. I didn't know what it was going to be like. It's my first time, but I think it's working okay. Have a wonderful day. Let me turn this recording off in case you say